call be dispensed with?
Without objection.
Madam President, this week the Senate is expected to vote on legislation that would repeal the authorization for use of military force in Iraq. The bill before the Senate would repeal two separate authorizations, one from 1991, which authorized U.S. intervention in Iraq, better known as the Gulf War, to stop dictator Saddam Hussein from invading and terrorizing Kuwait. The second one passed in 2022 in response to Saddam's persistent violations of the peace agreement that came out of the Gulf War, including intelligence that he was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. In the decades since these authorizations passed, America's relationship with Iraq has changed dramatically. Iraq has gone from a hostile and unpredictable authoritarian government to become a strategic partner with the United States. In recent years, our countries have worked together to end the occupation of ISIS in Iraq. In December of 2017, Iraq declared victory, though we've seen a resurgence of some of those terrorists recently. 2 years ago, President Biden welcomed the Iraqi Prime Minister to the White House, a friendship that would have been unimaginable 20 or 30 years ago. Put simply, Iraq is a key partner in the Middle East. Our governments and militaries cooperate to promote security and prosperity for the Iraqi people. More broadly, we work together to counter Iran's malign influence and continue to root out terrorism in the Middle East. While there's still an American military presence in Iraq, it looks dramatically different today than it did 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Today, our soldiers serve solely in an advise and assist role. They're there at the invitation of the Iraqi government to support Iraqi troops and military leaders as they defend their own security interests. In short, American forces are no longer there to counter threats from Iraq. We are now there to counter threats to Iraq. That includes threats from Iran, the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism, with its hired henchmen, terrorist groups, or other adversaries that could disrupt peace and stability in Iraq. Those who support repealing the Iraqi military authorizations point to this evolution in our relationship as evidence that the AUMFs are no longer needed. It has been 20 years since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and they say the authorizations are outdated. Our relationship has shifted, they argue, so it's time for those AUMFs to go. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Despite the fact that Iraq is now our partner, that doesn't mean it's time to abandon our security interests in the region. America still has very real adversaries in the Middle East who would do us and our allies harm if they got the chance. Today, Iran-backed militias operate in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and other countries throughout the Middle East. They are proxies of the Iranian military with the goal of spreading Iranian political influence far and wide. This isn't just some warmonger conspiracy theory. There's clear and absolute linkage between the Iranian regime and the militias operating throughout the Middle East. They're in effect hired guns, which are fighting to take territory that has been no man's land since the drawdown of U.S. forces in the Middle East. And in many cases, they continue to target U.S. troops. Just last Thursday, an Iranian drone targeted a U.S. facility in Syria, killing an American contractor and wounding 5 American service members. The U.S. responded the following day by conducting an airstrike against an Iran-backed militia in Syria. And then within hours, Iran's proxies launched another attack on a U.S. military base in Syria. Despite the fact that we know a great deal about these groups and their capabilities and the threat they pose to the Middle East, we're relatively limited in our efforts to counter their aggression. Counterterrorism missions rely on the 2001 Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which was passed in the wake of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. Since many Iran-backed militia have not been designated as terrorist organizations, the 2001 AUMF doesn't apply to them. That means we can only use the 2002 AUMF to counter Iranian-backed militia and other groups who pose threats to the stability of Iraq and to U.S. national security interests. If we were to repeal the 2002 AUMF, we limit the President's ability to target these groups. We, in effect, have withdrawn congressional consent. That applies to President Biden today, and it would apply to future commanders-in-chief as well. In effect, this would tie their hands when it comes to countering threats posed by Iran and its proxies. To state the obvious, we can't dispose of any tools that could be used to protect the United States or our partners. 3 presidents have cited the 2002 AUMF as an authorization for the use of military force. In 2003, President Bush used this authority to justify the invasion of Iraq. In other words, this was with congressional consent. In 2014, President Barack Obama cited the 2002 AUMF to justify strikes against Islamic State terrorists in Iraq and Syria. And then in 2020, former President Trump relied on this authority to justify the strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. Given the growing threats from Iran, it would be absurd to toss this authorization out the window today. If Congress repeals the Iraqi War Authorization, it prompts a lot of questions about what comes next. Without the 2002 AUMF, the President would lose the ability to contain Iran and its aggression. Iran's influence in the region would swell, and Iranian-backed militia would terrorize Syria and Iraq with impunity. Iran would be free to focus on its maniacal desire to destroy Israel, and without having to contend with the United States. It would be free to spend even more money financing terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Russian influence in Syria would grow, giving Putin a launch pad to further project power into the Middle East. Our friends and allies, no longer safe with America at their side, could succumb to coercive partnerships with China, giving Xi Jinping another region in which to compete with the United States for global primacy. In short, passing this legislation would create a power vacuum in the Middle East that could be filled by Iran, Russia, and China. We'd be ceding the region back to competition after working for years to promote stability. Of course, there are costs to maintaining our position in the Middle East, but the cost-benefit analysis clearly shows that we have to leave every authority in place to defend American and allied interests in the Middle East. Over the last few decades, as I said a moment ago, America's relationship with Iraq has changed for the better. It's a valuable partner. We work together to support security for Iraq and the region as a whole. The U.S. military works with Iraqi forces to counter threats from Iran and to reduce its influence in the region. These authorizations for the use of military force are key to our continued success. And it also means that we will continue to work with the executive branch rather than have the executive branch rely strictly on the President's constitutional powers. They give the President of the United States the flexibility needed to counter these threats and the threats that they pose from Iran. We would be doing Iran a huge favor by repealing these AUMFs. So suffice it to say, Madam President, I oppose the effort to repeal this Iraqi war authorization, and I encourage my colleagues in the Senate to join me in that opposition. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum.